there's so many misconceptions that the Trail of Tears was this singular event that used one road, and that this march en masse of 16,000 Cherokee. And it was actually over time, even though it's a limited time framework, but there were 17 detachments in the Trail of Tears that took different roads. And it's just such a bigger story.
You're listening to The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place. My name is Mike Rush, and today we continue our journey into the layered memory of Northwest Arkansas. When we think about the story of this region, the Trail of Tears is often treated as a distant event, a line in a history book, or something that was a singular event, something that passed through but was not a part of our story, or that it was disconnected from the shaping of our home. But I would argue that the truth is the opposite of that. My own path into this story began in January of 2024, out on a bike on a gravel road along Little Sugar Creek. Those quiet, winding roads, they were not just part of the Trail of Tears system, they were a convergence of all of these stories. They were the corridors of history. And it was there that I began to realize that on the very ground that I rode, it carried the weight of this history of tragedy and removal and displacement. And it was along these roads that the Cherokee Nation, along with many other Indigenous nations, were forcibly removed, passing through the hills and the hollows of this land, leaving behind a geography of sorrow and resilience and an enduring presence. So it's within that context, that very personal context, that I sought out today's guest, John McLarty. He's the project coordinator of the Arkansas chapter of the Trail of Tears Association and a longtime advocate for preserving the historic routes and the stories that are tied to this landscape. For over 2 decades, John has helped uncover forgotten roads and lost campsites and quiet testimonies written into the terrain of Northwest Arkansas. This work, along with others, led to the founding of Heritage Trail Partners, a local initiative that became the model for the state of Arkansas's entire Heritage Trail plan. Heritage Trail Partners was born from a project initiated by the Northwest Arkansas Regional Planning Commission in the early 2000s, where John served then as the assistant director. The goal was to develop a regional bike and pedestrian plan that could link the growing trail systems across our community. And as a part of that work, a decision was made to route some of these trails along historic roads that were originally tied to the Butterfield Overland Mail Route in Benton and Washington counties. But as the work progressed, it became very clear to John that these roads were a part and carried the stories of the Trail of Tears. They were once disconnected, but John's work was starting to bring them together, to connect them, and to show how the feet of so many Indigenous nations traveled these roads on their way to removal. And so today our conversation is rooted in these roads and how geography shaped the history and why remembering these stories matters so much, not just for the past, but for how we understood ourselves and our place today. All right, let's get into it. Well, I have a privilege today of sharing a table with John McLarty, who is the project coordinator for the Arkansas chapter of the Trail of Tears Association. And beyond that, you've also had an incredible history and career in how our region looks at trails and roads and the development of this space. And so, John, welcome to this conversation. It's a pleasure to share a table with you.
Well,
so
Mike,
thank you.
It's great to be here.
Well, thank you. I know you have so much in your mind about how all of these stories kind of come together. And so we can start wherever you would like. I think I would love to understand a little bit about your own personal background and how you got involved in this work.
Well, thank you for that. Interestingly enough, we moved here to Northwest Arkansas in 1972. People would have called us hippies. We kind of pushed back on that. We said, no, the hippies are out in San Francisco with flowers in their hair, and nothing wrong with that. But at the time, there was this big back to the land movement. And it was get back to nature, get back to clean water, grow your own food. So we were part of that. 3 friends of mine from high school came up here and bought land. We thought, we don't need college. We don't need a job. We just need 40 acres and some spring water, and we'll be great. So ended up meeting a hippie girl up here that was doing the same thing off in Madison County. And we ended up getting married. We were looking for every spiritual thing in the world except Christianity. And a family from Latvia just told us about Bible-believing Christians. So we became Christians and changed our lifestyle. So our kids grew up in a teepee, but then they remember this 180-degree turn where all of a sudden I had some direction and some rules for their life. They actually kind of enjoyed that. So my story is I was just working all kinds of jobs, factory jobs, truss shop, worked at the hospital and maintenance, and all the kids went to college. And once they left, I followed in their footsteps and went to college at the age of 45. So in 1995, went to college, U of A, as a freshman. Walked into class, and every first class, all the kids would think I was the teacher. I was 45, and they were like 19. So I went to the U of A, got a degree in geography, and loved history, but got a degree in geography because I loved maps. And after college, I'd specialized in computer mapping. Back then, it was a GPS and GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems. And I got a job at the Regional Planning Commission as a transportation planner. And then that kind of turned into assistant director. But relating to the Trail of Tears, the topic for today, we were given the task to create a regional bike and ped system, trail system. And I had studied in college as a geographic study and a mapping study, the route of the Butterfield Stagecoach. And I had this memory from my senior research paper that the Butterfield Stagecoach entered Northwest Arkansas up around Pea Ridge National Military Park and came down through Rogers, through Springdale, through Fayetteville, and then left the county down around, if people are familiar with the area, the good old town of Hogeye and Strickler. And so it was kind of a diagonal route through the two counties. So I suggested that, we could use that as a spine of a trail system and then branch off of that. So we had, of course, a subcommittee that was studying all that. So we decided to do that and created what we called the Heritage Trail Plan, which still exists today.
And this was what was the time period when that really started?
This would have been about 2002. But in this process of delineating the Butterfield, we kept coming across references to the Trail of Tears. So that became part of the Heritage Trail Plan. The first Heritage Trail Plan included the Butterfield Stagecoach Route, the Trail of Tears route, and I should say routes for the Trail of Tears, and then Civil War troop movements. So that was just the Heritage Trail Plan, which became the adopted regional trail plan. It's still a subset now, the full regional trail plan, but it's still in the long-range transportation plan.
The Heritage Trail Plan, how does that fit within the state's Heritage Trail Plan? Did one come before the other, or how does that work together?
That's a great question. The Heritage Trail Plan was a two-county plan. It was official policy. It wasn't just a group invented this plan. It was because we were working under the umbrella of the Northwest Arkansas Regional Planning Commission, which was the metropolitan planning organization and is for Northwest Arkansas. So this plan, you might say, had some teeth to it. The idea was that if a road on the Heritage Trail Plan was improved, that whatever jurisdiction, whether it be city or county or state, would accommodate bicycles and pedestrians in whatever way it made sense. If you're doing a road improvement and it's on the Heritage Trail Plan, you should incorporate accommodating bike and bicycles and pedestrians. So then that plan, actually with our president at the time, Marilyn Hefner, took that idea and wrote legislation, drafted legislation for it to be a statewide plan, because all those elements, the Trail of Tears, the Butterfield Stagecoach, and the Civil War troop movements have a statewide footprint. So the state actually adopted their version of the Heritage Trail Plan, which we are totally for. It does not have the same requirement of bike and pedestrian improvements, but it's more like signage and interpretive panels and a brochure that talks about it.
The estate plan grew out of the work that you
Yes,
were directly involved in.
Actually, yes, it did.
Yeah, I didn't understand how all of that worked together. So I think the context of that, is really neat. So as a part of that work, and you kept coming across the Trail of Tears components of this, like maybe give us a framework of why did this really matter to the state and to the work that you were doing?
Well, now this is where I get really excited, because as we studied the Butterfield and then the Trail of Tears, it turns out that the major route of both of those historic events were along what's now called the Old Wire Road. Some places it's called the Old Missouri Road. Up in Rogers, it's Arkansas Avenue or Arkansas Street, goes right through the downtown. There's little pieces of the Old Wire Road up around Pea Ridge. And then you just find these remnants of the old wire road. And it turns out we discovered in the 1820s, late 1820s, the military built a road to connect the forts on the frontier. So there was a road from St. Louis to Springfield to Fort Smith. Well, the road from Springfield to Fort Smith through Fayetteville became the Old Wire Road. It was the Old Missouri Road. Some of the old maps refer to it as the Springfield to Fayetteville Road. So it was, you might say, the interstate of the 1830s. So when they removed the Cherokee from their homelands in North Carolina and Georgia, at some part Tennessee and Alabama, to the Indian Territory, they used that road for we call it the Northern Route. I have this quote, but it's because the road, first because the geography was there, the road was there, and because the road was there, the history was there. So they used that road to remove the Cherokee. One of the things I discovered as a geographer, we were in a separate study at Regional Planning. We were looking at the watersheds of Northwest Arkansas. So we have a very interesting geography here, in the sense that the White River in these two counties is flowing to the north. Starts around Winslow and is flowing to the north, goes up into Missouri, wraps back around Table Rock and becomes Bull Shoals down in central Arkansas, but it's flowing north. And then another major river system is the Illinois River. So the White River is flowing north and kind of to the east, and the Illinois is flowing north up from around Strickler, around Devil's Den area, flows north and then cuts over towards Salem Springs. So there's this very subtle, you might say, divide, like the Continental Divide, but it's the Ozark Divide. And everything in these watersheds, everything to the east is going into the White River system. Everything to the west is going into Illinois. And that line is basically the Old Wire Road. So it's a very subtle ridge, you might say, divide. And the interesting thing about that, Mike, is that in a flood event, in a major flood event, like we just had a lot of rain where all the rivers are overflowing, that divide is the only way to get from Missouri down to Oklahoma and cross these two counties and not have to cross a major river. So in a flood event, that's the route you would take through. And it has the least river crossings, and it's flatter terrain, less ups and downs. So as we studied it, we got so fascinated by that, and then got involved with the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. And they kind of verified that road predates the military. The military didn't just forge this completely new path through the woods. It was like an old Indian trace. So that's what, just as a historian, and you might say amateur historian, I didn't have a degree in history, but the trade between St. Louis and the Spiral Mounds down Oklahoma probably used that road, because the terrain made sense and the water crossings made sense. So you just add geography and then to the history and then, the Trail of Tears, and it just became quite fascinating to me. And as we would show that in public events, it was really picked piqued people's interest.
And it sounds like these routes, they've held memories since the beginning of time that we can tell, and to be used as, to your point, to those Indian buffalo traces for trading routes. But like to see that route develop over time, probably originally by Indigenous communities as a place of trade and movement, but also later in to be used as a tool of removal is, that juxtaposition is a hard, it's kind of hard to wrap my head around in many ways. And so,
it makes the whole story become so compelling. As we discovered that, and just a little interesting side note, at the time, the idea of trails in Northwest Arkansas, bike and pedestrian facilities, was kind of unpopular because people thought, a waste of taxpayer monies. Why would we do this? This was only for people that run bicycle professionals or enthusiasts that have these $1,000 bicycles, and the average person just wants to go to a ballpark and play soccer. So when we added, we didn't have this figured out ahead of time, but when we added history to our trail system, it became part of like Americana. So when we said, well, this is not just a trail system, we're commemorating the Butterfield Stagecoach Route, the Trail of Tears, and the Civil War routes. It was like, who can be against that? So people had these, so the rodeo of the Ozarks got all excited about this, and chambers of commerce saw it not just as a trail, but as a historic route, and kind of maybe attract tourism and tell the story of Northwest Arkansas. So all of a sudden, most of the opposition to trails vanished. And so adding the history to the trails really helped the trail system for Northwest Arkansas. I would say it was huge. It was a turning point.
As a part of that kind of history process, I'm curious, where did you start? You mentioned some oral history around the Butterfield. How did that history process and uncovering that history around the Trail of Tears specifically, what were your sources? Where did you begin? What did the process
look
like?
Great question. So it turns out in 1958, which was the 100th year anniversary of the Butterfield, there was a lot of research done, signs put up. So we went to libraries and just newspaper articles, and a lot was written about the Butterfield. As I said, I started discovering references to, and this was also the Trail of Tears. We just found a lot of research. We're doing new research today because of things are being digitized, and we've discovered new documents in the Treasury archives in Washington, D.C. But we found a lot of information that was already here on the Trail of Tears. Wash County Historic Society, people out at Prairie Grove had a lot of information, in Cane Hill, Pea Ridge National Military Park.
There is this memory, obviously, of the Trail of Tears that's in these different places, but it sounds like those were like separated memories. They weren't, your work came in to really try to connect.
Pull it all together.
That's how I would view it.
It was these vague pieces, and some of the stories kind of survived vetting and research, because there's all kinds of stories, just like the Butterfield went everywhere according to old stories, and the same with the Trail of Tears. So and there was a lot of Cherokee movement before the Trail of Tears. There was a lot of voluntary migration. The Treaty Party, and then there in Oklahoma, in the Indian Territory, there's the old settlers that had been coming here since the 1820s. And they obviously came on roads. Then you had the Treaty Party, and then you had the forced removal. So 3 different groups over 3 different periods of time. So a lot of the old settlers might have come through a certain part of Arkansas, and that's just the old stories. Well, the Cherokee came through here, and therefore it's the Trail of Tears. Well, when you get into the history of the Trail of Tears, the National Park Service and the Congressional Act that designated, it's this very narrow time framework of the forced removal, which is 1838 and 1839. So we had to delineate a lot of stories as to they were legitimate, but they weren't the forced removal.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting component of this work, is even though this memory was here, that it was able to be, it was
segmented.
All segmented. You were able to pull this information together. So maybe begin us down the work that's kind of you're involved in today and what this looks like around the Trail of Tears. I've got a ton of little questions, but give us a framework to think through the Trail of Tears and the importance of that for Northwest Arkansas.
So as Heritage Trail Partners developed, and then we became that group, we formed a 501c3 because our director at the time very correctly noted that this calls for involvements that are beyond the scope of Regional Planning Commission. And Marilyn Hefner, our president at the time, Marilyn kind of chased the Butterfield story. She was really interested in Fayetteville history, and she was at one time the mayor of Fayetteville. So she became the Butterfield expert, and I jumped into the Trail of Tears. So I joined the National Trail of Tears Association. They have a conference once a year, so their first conference I went to was in Fort Smith. So I jumped into the Trail of Tears and met Cherokee that knew the story. And we were just realizing the story that they passed through. They came through Northwest Arkansas. So I ended up going to conferences in Cherokee, North Carolina, Rome, Georgia, Chattanooga, Tennessee, and became familiar with this whole picture of the Trail of Tears. And Mike, I think one of the big things I like to inform people about is there's just this idea, there's so many misconceptions that the Trail of Tears was this singular event that used one road, and that this march en masse of 16,000 Cherokee. And it was actually over time, even though it's a limited time framework, but there were 17 detachments in the Trail of Tears that took different roads. And it's just such a bigger story. Just even the roads they took, even when they came into Northwest Arkansas, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, they didn't all just march one route through Northwest Arkansas into Oklahoma. As they came into Northwest Arkansas, they split up or took different routes into Indian Territory. There's 3 distinct routes just through these 2 counties that we discovered. But when I discovered the bigger picture of the whole idea of removal, it just was fascinating to me because it's so much part of the American story. And it's a tragedy. It's a dark story, but it has to be told. I went through a personal revelation. These aren't just lines on a map for a trail. From lines on a map to a story that must be told, as I learned more about the Cherokee story.
Yeah, and I'll share a map on the episode webpage so that people can really look at it, because when you look at all the different routes, this is a mass movement of people that really kind of at the end of that converges here in Northwest Arkansas. And so you've got really a national story.
It's a national story.
But to have that center focal kind of ending point here in and around Northwest Arkansas really brings a weight to maybe our responsibility of how we think about what these stories are. And so, yeah, when you say that from lines on a map to stories that have to be told, where do we even begin with these kinds of stories about understanding that? And how can your work, or how does your work, help us start to get our head around some of that?
Yeah, great question. I guess we can start off with the big picture. I always love to give the big picture. So I call this kind of Trail of Tears 101. So the Trail of Tears is the forced removal of the Cherokees, specifically from 1837 to 1839. It was originated in their homeland, which is North Carolina, the Eastern Cherokee, which they're still there, by the way. There's still a nation over there, but it's centered on North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. So we actually took a trip over there and had just learned from a lot of scholars that study it over in the East, and my Cherokee friends. And just some of the basics is there was this idea to remove the Cherokee and all of we call them the civilized tribes, and they were from the Southeast. So there was it was just a land grab, really. It was the Europeans, the whites, let's call them the whites, wanted the land. They wanted the land. It was prime land in Georgia. It was good plantation land that the Cherokee had, and then great land in North Carolina. And then they discovered gold. in Georgia in 1828. A lot of people don't know that. There was gold discovered in Georgia in 1828. Northern Georgia is one of the first gold rushes. So kind of the story real quickly is the bad news for the Indians. And they, by the way, I say Indians, and the Cherokee use that term, Indians. So Native Americans or indigenous peoples. And I say Indian because so much of the history, in May 28th of 1830, this all really got bad for the Cherokee when it was called the Federal Indian Removal Act. So Andrew Jackson was elected president in 1828. Georgia discovered gold in 1828. And then in 1830, Andrew Jackson and the Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. And that's what started, you might say, the bad news for the Cherokee. At the time, they were wanting to assimilate. The Cherokee were actually, a lot of them were quite prosperous. We went to these homes in Georgia that were like mansions, and they were plantation owners, and they had ferries and stores, and they were like doing quite well, thank you. And they lived in, a lot of people think of the Indians back in the 1830s living in mud huts or wigwams or whatever. They were living in log cabins. They had spinning wheels. They had cast iron. And you just have to think, I was researching this a little last night, Plymouth Rock, the Pilgrims come into America. Well, there was some earlier settlements in Jamestown, was a little earlier than that. But we think of 1620, right? So by 1820, when the Southeastern Indians really became kind of an area of focus, there had been interactions between the Europeans and the Indians for 200 years. That's a lot of interaction. So the Southeastern Indians, especially the Cherokee, Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, they had adopted a lot of the European ways. So it's just, they were very high into education and success, but they wanted to keep their culture also. So I really want to emphasize that. But they were making the case as we can be part of this American experience. We don't need to be removed. We're assimilating. And they had one of my great myth dispellers of the whole misconception of the Cherokee is in one of my PowerPoints. I've got a picture of Jesse Bushyhead, who in 1830s was an ordained, of all things, Baptist preacher. He was a lawyer, and he would go to Washington, D.C. and argue their case before Congress. Very educated man. So they weren't just these third world living just around fires, and nothing wrong with that. But if they were living like that, doesn't justify removal. But they were very sophisticated in their lifestyle. So then in 1832, and this is so fascinating, this is what makes it the American story. I'll try to tell this quickly. There's a Supreme Court case, Worcester versus Georgia. So the Georgians passed anti-Indian acts because of the gold and because of the plantations. And they basically said no one can come into the state of Georgia and do commerce with the Indians unless you have approval from the state of Georgia. Well, there was already a missionary there called Samuel Worcester. And he was like, well, I have the permit. I was invited here by the Cherokee. I have the permission from the federal government to be here. So I don't need the permission of the state of Georgia, thank you. They threw him in jail. They threw Samuel Worcester in jail and sentenced him to 4 years of hard labor. Then this became a national case. It wasn't an isolated state case. This became a national case. And then, in fact, kind of the New England educated, like Ralph Waldo Emerson, became aware of this, and they were outraged. It's like, we can't have a missionary thrown into jail in Georgia. And it became a states' rights versus federal issue. So it was taken to the Supreme Court. And the Cherokee were part of that. So you had friends of the court and New England lawyers and arguing that they took this case to the Supreme Court that Georgia did not have the right to throw Samuel Worcester in jail because he had the permission from the feds, which that's who deals with treaties, right? It's federal jurisdiction. And he had been invited there by the Cherokee Nation, which had a degree of sovereignty. So it went to the Supreme Court, and I think it was Marshall that was the justice, they ruled in favor of Worcester. And they told Georgia, you have to let him go. And Georgia said, no, we won't. Come get him. So Andrew Jackson refused to enforce the decision of the Supreme Court. So it was a constitutional crisis of the 1830s. And that's still, interestingly, all these Indian rights cases going on in Oklahoma, they go back to Worcester versus Georgia. That the Supreme Court ruling is that federal jurisdiction over Indian tribes supersedes states' jurisdiction over Indian tribes. And so that's the precedent. That was set back then. So what happened? Georgia didn't let him out. So Worcester, his wife, and everybody's like, you know what? Andrew Jackson, the executive branch, isn't going to follow the rules of the Supreme Court. So, gee, what do? We followed all the rules. What are we going to do? So Worcester basically said, okay, I'll leave Georgia. So rather than go back to his comforts, and he's really a kind of a hero, he moved to Indian Territory. He said, I'll just go ahead and move out west to the new Indian Territory. So he was he could have gone back to the comforts of home, but he was so, you might say, dedicated and entrenched with his work there that he moved out here to Indian Territory. And so that kind of dissipated the constitutional. Georgia was threatening secession over this. They're like, no, we're going to treat the Indians how we want to. They're within our jurisdiction. It was truly a precursor to the Civil War.
Thank you for sharing that. I don't think I've ever heard that context before, and I'm not a historian either, but the origin of that brings a different weight to it, especially because that tribal sovereignty, McGirt decision in Oklahoma, all of these things, these are still conversations that we're having.
Can you see how I got so drawn into this? Yeah. I was like, oh my goodness. Then in December 29th of 1835, the Treaty of New Eshota was signed by a minority faction of the Cherokee Nation. So federal agents went down and they got a group of Cherokee that were a minority, but they were let's just say, more affluent. And in a sense, Worcester had just been decided they were not going to follow the Supreme Court. So they just thought, Andrew Jackson's not going to recant. He's not going to back off. So in one sense, you could say the treaty party kind of saw the writing on the wall. And they said, you know what, let's just get the best deal we can and go ahead and move to the West. So they did. And there's a certain, you could say, well, were they really the voluntary party? Well, you have to think of the threat they were under. They saw, and it turns out, in a sense, they saw correctly, they're going to remove us eventually. So we can just go ahead and go out there and get started, maybe go during a good time of year to get the crop started, or we can wait here. Now, so they signed the treaty.
So, yeah, the treaty party, this was Major Ridge in that role at the time. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was some Cherokee leaders of you might say renown, of status. And it was Major Ridge and Boudinot and Stanwady. And they had some leadership. They weren't just kind of pulled up from lower levels. And the opposition to the treaty party was John Ross. He was the principal chief. And actually, they had passed a law, the Cherokee Nation had passed a law, that it would be, they'd lost so much land, they said it would be the death penalty to give up any more land. So Ridge and Boudinot and Stanwady, they kind of said, we may be signing our death warrant, but they signed it. Now, here's what's fascinating. So this treaty still had to go to the Senate to be ratified. It was ratified by one vote. So think about that. It wasn't like America en masse was like 99%, yes, let's get these Cherokee out of here, and all the southeastern tribes. It was a huge controversy. And again, there was the New England, kind of the newspaper people saying, no, this is wrong. They have shown us goodwill, good faith in every measure. They have Now, their typical lifestyle was 15 acres with hogs and some corn and a musket, and they had developed their educational system. The Cherokee Nation had developed a government of executive branch, legislative, and judicial. They had a newspaper. They had their own language. So they they were making the case. The Cherokee were like, we don't need to, we're fine here. We're doing well. We don't need to be removed. So it was kind of a national debate. And when you think about it, by one vote, the Treaty of Neoshoda was passed. So my story, when I tell this in a PowerPoint, it's like this idea that Americans are just completely evil and have always been. No, it was a national debate. It was kind of 50-50. And who knows, that one vote might have been some shenanigans going on to get that last vote to get the treaty. So this was to get the Treaty of Neoshoda signed. So it was signed on May 23rd, 1836, ratified it by one vote. And then the Cherokees were given 2 years to voluntarily move to the west. So by the spring of 1838, of about 16,000 Cherokee, only 2,000 had voluntarily removed. So then you get into the Trail of Tears. General Winfield Scott, famous name in military history, he was ordered on May 24th, 1838, to use federal troops to begin the roundup. And here's another part of kind of the stories that have to be dispelled. Some professors in the East did this pretty detailed story. The federal troops, for the most part, were well behaved. They were like, this is our duty. Some of them we have quotes like, this is the worst thing I've ever had to do, is round up these Cherokee and march them basically to concentration camps, to holding facilities. On the other hand, the Georgia State Militia, they get a pretty bad rap. So primarily, when you hear the stories of being prodded by bayonets and herded like cattle, and there are quotes, that's stories about the Georgia State Militia rounding up the Cherokee, literally dragging them out of their houses, giving them an hour to gather up their belongings, leaving most behind. And then the Georgians were literally moving into those lands, moving into the cabins. So they were kind of the bad actors. For the most part, the federal troops were, you might say, not into this. This wasn't a joy to them because they weren't from that area. They were on assignment. They lived up in Virginia or Massachusetts. They just wanted to get the job done and get home. The Georgia State Militia were moving into the territory. So it's really fascinating that you have to delineate even these stories. That the American military, sometimes there's pictures of them treating the Cherokee so bad. But you just have to give a little credit to the military. They were there under orders doing a terrible thing, and it was the law of the day. And yes, they could have refused to do it. Probably some of them did. But it was the Georgia militia was like, yeah, this is where we want them out of here. So the Cherokee were rounded up, and then you just have the stories of the horribleness of the camps. You have eyewitnesses from some of the military officials and some missionaries that were there. If you can picture, maybe some of the listeners can picture a prison camp in the Civil War, Andersonville, and the dysentery and the bad water and lack of food. So they were moved into these camps in the heat of Tennessee, Georgia summers, and it just became awful conditions.
Yeah, that's a terrible picture, basically what we've seen in storytelling and filmmaking. That sounds like to use that imagery is really hard.
And one thing to point out, though, is I just can't return from a trip to Houston, and I've been in Washington, D.C. to the Holocaust Museum. And I do not compare this to the Holocaust. The Holocaust was so awful. Being crammed into the cattle cars, and the intent was killing. And most people agree that the intent with the Cherokee and the Seminole, the whole Indian removal at that time, was not to round them up and kill them all. It was to move them, which is horrible enough, forced removal, but it was not the goal to exterminate. So these camps, It's just kind of a tragic set of events because they moved them into the camps, and it was kind of the spring. And the idea was to remove them by water. So 3 groups went by water, and it was just fairly straightforward, get them on the steamboats. And actually it was still all terrible because the Indians didn't even get on the steamboats. They were pulled on flatboats behind the steamboats. And then a lot of death and sickness. And then they got to, of all things, they got around to Little Rock, and the Arkansas River was low. So they couldn't get to Indian Territory, to Fort Smith, and on up to Fort Gibson. So they were having to disembark and travel by land anyway. And that was they needed wagons instead of boats. So word was coming back that the water removal wasn't working. So that's supposed to be pretty clockwork-like. They're all going by river into Indian Territory, and it should take quite a month or 2. So when the river removal didn't work, the Cherokee themselves said, let us remove ourselves. Give us the dignity. We've kind of on our honor. We're leaving. So let us remove ourselves. So John Ross and other leaders petitioned Winfield Scott and said, let us remove ourselves. So one of the consequences of that, though, and it would have been anyway, whether it was under federal oversight or not, was they had to hire wagons. They had to gear up. So they got stuck in those Georgian and Tennessee camps over the summer, which I'm just pointing out, that was not the federal intention, is to get the Indians rounded up and stay in these camps all summer. But they did. The circumstances led to that. And that's some of the most awful stories are actually from those camps. And again, Andersonville, and you just think about too many people in too small space with inadequate water. So it just turned into a terrible situation. So by the time they actually, you might say, hit the road, and it was kind of, I can just imagine this, they were glad to get out of the camps. They would have rather gone back home. But just to move out of those camps with dysentery and sickness and sewage problems. So, but the removal itself is the travel of removal is this awful story, because now it was late in the year and they got stuck in one of the worst winters. 1838 was one of the worst winters. It got so cold that the Mississippi River literally froze up and turned into ice blocks. So of the detachments that came overland through Illinois and Missouri, about half of them got across the Mississippi before it froze up. Some of them got stuck on the other side of the Mississippi and had to wait for it to thaw out. That's why some of them were as late as 1839 getting here. So that's kind of the big picture. So now we have them out of Georgia and North Carolina, and they're on their way here to Indian Territory.
And when we think about it, like one of these detachments, because that's how they traveled, if I understand correctly, this is a massive amount of people. These could be groups of 1,000 people. What would the size?
That's exactly correct. There was about 16,000, 17,000 Cherokee. They were broken up into 17 detachments of about 1,000 each, 800 to 1,000 each. And that's what's so fascinating. People just think of the whole tribe, the whole nation moved at once. It was these separate detachments. And there were reasons they were together. There were kind of these natural groups of geography that lived with each other. Some of them one detachment was a lot of Baptists, led by this Jesse Bushyhead, and the missionary Evan Jones formed. Jesse Bushyhead was one of the detachment leaders. Mm-hmm. So they had things in common. They knew each other. So it wasn't just like line up 16,000 people and have them count 1 through 17, and that's the detachment you're in. There were natural groups. And then there was, of course, sustenance problems along the way, weather, terrible events and that's the Trail of Tears. But it's not a singular trail, because some of them came through Missouri. One group came straight across the northern counties of northwest Arkansas.
John, when we think about these detachments too, some of these journeys, 1,000 people, maybe over 800 plus miles, the logistics of trying to do that and the time, it seems to me like overwhelming from a condition standpoint.
Yeah, the idea was that there were around 800 to 1,000 per detachment, and then they were traveling 800, 900 miles, depending on where their camp had been. Just the logistics of that. So you had wagons, supplies. They would travel maybe 15, 20 miles a day and have to camp. And then, but when you think everybody's been camping, think about campground for maybe 10 people and how big of a footprint. People think, oh, this is like up in Pea Ridge Military Park. There was a camp there. And you think it wasn't on the size of a little parking lot. Think of a camp for 1,000 people. That's huge. And think of feeding 1,000 people. So they had pre-purchased supplies along the way. They had scouts and had supply depots. But that's just, again, full of corruption and the whites overcharging. The whites got the word that the Cherokee were coming through. They had some funds to buy cornmeal and salt pork. It just cheated them. Doubled the ferry prices. Just made money off removal. So it's just a tragedy upon tragedy. And because we had letters of John Ross and these detachment leaders complaining that they're being basically ripped off along the way, as bad as things were anyway, or supplies not being delivered, or them getting the worst of the cornmeal. It's full, it's moldy, and it's no good, and just horrible stories upon horrible stories.
Maybe when I think about the history books and the things that I learned, what the picture that you're painting seems very different, meaning like this left a footprint. This was not an insignificant 100 people walking down a road. This was a massive movement of people over an incredible amount of time, that this left a footprint wherever they went.
Right, yeah, and there are a lot of stories about just the corruption along the way. And word got out that, we have these hungry Cherokee that are coming through, and Chickasaw, and is across the whole state. But here in Northwest Arkansas, it was only the Cherokee.
Because by the time you get to Northwest Arkansas, if this journey was supposed to last 30 days or 45 days by water, the potential, the reality, sometimes this could last 6 months, it could last 9 months.
Right.
Based on like supplies, and you've got people getting paid, obviously, to move people and remove them. Like the being taken advantage of in those spaces feels like by the time you get to Arkansas, I'm assuming the conditions of what these detachments are going through is probably really bad. Is that a fair assessment?
That is fair. And one of the stories that really struck me when the lines on the map became stories that must be told, there was a group that came through, and actually they were one of the early group. They were actually one of the last remnants of the treaty party. And this is why you say they weren't forced to remove. Well, the treaty party really was forced. It wasn't their decision.
Right.
They weren't just sitting around 1830 and then just all of a sudden said, hey, I have a good idea. Let's move to Indian Territory. They were under the gun, so to speak. But this one treaty party, and the reason I use this is because this treaty party kept excellent journal. They're actually accompanied by some military people. This is B. Buchanan's account. And it's just this little terse account, but it talks about this group, and there's the same road. That's why we use it a lot, is they used the landmarks. And they purchased from people that we can trace back to the 1830s. They come into Missouri, so they've already been on the road for weeks. And they get to Missouri and they bury a child up in southern Missouri. Then they bury another child around the Pea Ridge area. And then, so they're saying we bought some grain from Fitzgerald's, is one of the places, Fitzgerald Station in Springdale. John Fitzgerald was there and sold the Indians. I don't know that it was, some of the people weren't, not everybody was ripping off. Some of it was just market value, but he sold them some fodder. And then they get down to Cane Hill, and there's a receipt and an entry in this journal that the dates match, and it's so eerie. And it said they purchased a coffin for a Cherokee girl. And it was from James Coulter of Cane Hill. I believe it was $2.35. So I was reading that, and at the time just looking for geographic clues. Pea Ridge, which was the Ruddick Farm, Fitzgerald, then James Coulter in the Cane Hill area. And then upon one of my readings, I thought, wait a minute, They buried 3 Cherokee children in the last week of their journey. And just at the time, we had this 12-year-old girl, our daughter, and I just thought, what would that feel like? And they were almost to the end of their journey. So she probably got sick in Missouri, and you're talking about the tragedy. And the further you got, the supplies would get lower and lower. They would get more worn out, sickness and death. And to be so close to home. So Cane Hill is just one more day, and you're in Indian territory. And you want to stop and nurture this child, and she dies in Cane Hill. And I just thought, how does a family, I've known families that they lose a child unexpectedly, and it just puts the family on hold. It's so tragic. And I thought, then they had to get into Indian territory, and instead of take a year off to grieve, here they are in Indian territory, and it's January. And they have to find food and figure out how they're just going to live through the winter and get a crop planted in spring. So the Cherokee and all the Indian nations, their resilience is so remarkable. And I just gained, it's a tragedy, and it's a respect for the Cherokee people, and again, all the tribes that experienced this removal, and their resilience, and that they're still here today. They're right over there, an Indian nation, and doing pretty good, you might say. But the tragedy they went through really struck me, and that's when it became stories that needed to be told. Her name's Alcee Timberlake. And I don't know if you met Susan Young out at Cane Hill, but we discovered her in 05 and 06, and Susan did a little deep dive and figured out through the census records that she was probably 12 or 13. So we had a thought, and it took the Cane Hill historic group out there to finally put it into reality. But there's a sign. We thought we need to commemorate Alcee Timberlake. She was a tragic death. And it turns out there's still Timberlakes, Cherokee. And the Cane Hill invited them over. They put up a sign in memory of Alcee Timberlake. And some of the Timberlake offspring came over for that ceremony.
I think one of the things that's also of interest to me, too, is that when we think about the Trail of Tears, we talk about a lot of that is based around what are considered the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes. But there was a lot of other nations that came through on these routes as well, too. Quapaw people. Like, this isn't just the Cherokee people. This is a story that goes beyond that to a whole lot of other indigenous nations as well, too.
That is very correct. And you really have to think about, so who was here in Arkansas before the Cherokee? This isn't their native homeland. It was the Quapaw and the Osage. And so the Osage were removed. Before this forced removal, parts of northwest Arkansas were actually part of the Cherokee reservation. And the Osage were moved out to make room for the Cherokee. And this would have been pre-removal, so 1816, 1820s. So that's what we call the old settlers that were here first. But the Osage had to be moved out, the Quapaw. So yeah, there were these pre-removal removals. And their story is just as tragic. It wasn't as long of a journey for the Osage and the Quapaw because they were closer to what would be the new Indian territory. But they were removed, not voluntarily, from their homelands.
Yeah. Talk about, if you will, like some of the maybe more significant sites here in northwest Arkansas. You mentioned there's 3 kind of main arteries, for lack of better words, that people used. Do we still see remnants of these detachments that came through here? Or how do we think about that in northwest Arkansas?
Yeah, that's great, because that's part of why these stories need to be told. But it helps to tell the story if you have remnants of the journey and the camping grounds and places where you can walk the road they walked on. So that's so part of what became our mission. And not only Heritage Trail Partners, but the Trail of Tears, is to preserve these places and tell the stories and give people a sense of place, that this happened here. This tragic story that we've just kind of hit the highlights of, the death and the suffering and I'm going to say starvation. I have to correct that a little bit. Malnutrition would be a better term than starvation. So here in Northwest Arkansas, the 11 detachments that came through the two counties all entered up around Pea Ridge, because on this Springfield to Fayetteville road we talked about, they came from Springfield down and entered the state at where Pea Ridge is, and that was a camp. And that's you want a sense of place. Our listeners can go to Elkhorn Tavern in Pea Ridge National Military Park and stand at Elkhorn Tavern and look to the north and walk to the north, and that is the Trail of Tears. That is it's unpaved. It's a road you can walk on, and the Cherokee come over here and have events and literally ceremonies and walk that road. That is one of the most intact road segments that looks as it would have looked in the 1830s.
I've actually walked that road. It's amazing.
Yeah. Then you come from Pea Ridge. Then some of the groups you get down to around Avoca area, Brightwater, Avoca. Then some of the groups, well, a backstory here, they had been assigned different disbandment depots in Indian Territory. One of them was around Westville, Oklahoma. One's around Maysville, and then one's around Stillwell. So if you just think of the Oklahoma border, there's three disbandment depots. And this is kind of where you get into there was this sense of not to exterminate the Cherokee. They didn't want them all showing up at the same place at the same time because there wouldn't be enough food. So they had 3 assigned depots, and the idea was that there would be food there. And so one of the depots was in Maysville, so 5 groups split off or took a road from around Avoca and went almost due west through Bentonville, Centerton area, and ended up in Maysville. So that's one route. You come down, it's like north-south, and then there's these 3 routes that go on to Indian Territory. The rest of them came down to around Fitzgerald Station, which is in Springdale, and that's a site. We'll have to back up geographically. They came through incredible place in Northwest Arkansas, south of Rogers, is Cross Hollow. That's the site of a huge Civil War camp. But the Cherokee came there. There's good water there. They camped there. So from Pea Ridge down through Rogers, some of them split off and went to the Maysville area. Then some down through Cross Hollow to Fitzgerald. And Fitzgerald was kind of a turning point. From Fitzgerald, they went over, and this is a new route we worked to put on the map. The National Park Service did not have this route. We did the research to put it on there. From Fitzgerald Station over to Mount Comfort. Comfort was a kind of a huge known area. There were settlers there. There were the Tuttles and the Cunninghams there in the 1830s. And there's references in these journals to buying supplies from Cunningham. And then we found the Cunningham place on the 1830s map. So that's a great route. And that area, that goes right through parts of Springdale, and then the Holt School over there was around the Cunningham and Mount Comfort. So there's a campsite there that I'd say right now, very few people know about it. We just literally put it on the map, officially, the National Park Service map. Then from there, some of them went from Cunningham's and went due west out toward Westville through Old Cincinnati. And then other groups went on down from the Cunningham place to Cane Hill. Down through Prairie Grove Military Park is a place on the Trail of Tears. And then down to around Evansville, and then crossed over to Indian Territory. Around the Cunningham place, which a lot of the detachments came through, is the Holt School, and then there's that Gary Hampton ballpark. And what's really amazing about that was a campground. We have a journal where it said they camped out 1/2 mile in advance of the Cunningham place, where we know the exact location of the Cunningham place has been torn down. But the campground would have been at that Gary Hampton ballpark, which is owned by the city of Fayetteville. And there's a creek running through it. There's a trail running through it. So that's a great site that someday there will be some signage there and then one of these interpretive panels. And then Cane Hill is a great place. Prairie Grove wants to do some interpretation. So there's a lot of opportunity, more than most people would think, because the Trail of Tears split into these 3 routes, the Northwest Arkansas. There's a lot of road remnants. something, to be honest, we haven't discovered yet.
Yeah, it sounds like this is still...
It's ongoing research.
We're still learning. And who knows what we're going to continue to learn in that space.
Yeah, like the road from the Mount Comfort out to Old Cincinnati. There's going to be, we kind of have in general the county road that would approximate that, but there's going to be off the county road some original road segments, and then a lot of the county road. And see, that's what this research is ongoing. Yeah. So what was the road in 1838? And then what's left of that road? Some of it, like the Old Wire Road, is still intact. It's the Old Wire Road of today is just about dead on of where it was in the 1830s.
Yeah, this ongoing story of the Trail of Tears still has the ability to form and shape how we think about our community and our region. From your perspective today, how should this history inform how we think about our place and how we think about our role in preserving this history?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because it's so relevant today to remember this story. And I just think about my own personal experience. I have this great admiration for the Cherokee people, and it's personal. Like I'm going to say one of my best friends is Troy Wayne Poteet. He lives in Webbers Falls. He's the executive director of the National Trail of Tears Association, and we are great friends. And I just love his stories, and he actually he's a Cherokee storyteller. So you get him going. You think I have a lot to talk about. He has a lot to talk about. And Mike, there's just so much here. When you talk to, say, Troy Wayne, or you get a group of the Cherokee at a conference and you're kind of in the lobby of a hotel, they start telling these stories. And they start talking about Uncle Joe married so-and-so and such cousin. And they're talking, all of a sudden you realize they are talking about people that were alive in the 1830s. And it's just a challenge to me. Can you talk fluently about your ancestors from the 1830s? Do we even know who they are?
Not only
who
not
they
fluently,
married?
not at all.
So see that they remember their past and they keep these stories alive. And it's still meaningful to them. And that's a challenge to me and my family. And just the importance of those stories and your family and your history and then place. And so I have a great admiration for the Cherokee people. Another thing I'll kind of note that we can learn from them. My first introduction to the Cherokee people was at an event at Pea Ridge. So we were dedicating a panel there, interpretive panel, and they wanted to walk that road. And they brought the Cherokee Youth Choir over, which is so incredible. Young people, all dressed in Cherokee garb, and they presented a program. And about half, if not all the program, were hymns. And I thought, wow, this is really strange. I like hymns. They were singing in Cherokee, but hymns we know, Amazing Grace, things like When the Roll is Called Up Yonder, I'll Be There. I thought, well, this is really different. And then they marched in the Cherokee Honor Guard, and it's the Cherokee flag and the American flag. And the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation got up and he said, I want to tell everybody something here. We want this story told, this tragedy. We don't want it ever forgotten. And we don't want it repeated like ever again in American history. But we are not perpetual victims. Our story is we survived this. We're resilient. And we came back and we reestablished our nation. We rebuilt churches. We rebuilt schools. We rebuilt agriculture. And we're doing pretty good. We send our teams to win state championships. And they have one of the highest per capita enrollments in the U.S. military of all the Indian nations. And they're proud about that. Oh, my word. Here they were treated so horribly by this nation. I want people to make this personal. The Cherokee, you think all this animosity between the whites and the Indians. Well, it turns out pre-Civil War, there was all this interaction between Washington and Benton County and the Cherokee Nation, commerce. And People don't even believe. I couldn't believe this when I discovered it. The first sheriff of Washington County was Lewis Evans. He led a cattle herd, a cattle drive from here to California, pre-Civil War, like 1840s. He teamed up with Cherokee cattlemen, and they drove cattle together, the whites and the Indians. Rather than fighting each other, like we see in all the Westerns, they drove cattle together from this area, Cherokee Nation and Washington County, as far as Carroll County, and drove herds of cattle on the Cherokee Trail and joined the Santa Fe Trail. So there's this kind of interaction starting to develop.
It's so hard to just even comprehend how that all takes place, being on so far detached and seeing our American story, but to be able to think about how that actually takes place to me is
that interaction.
Yeah, I don't even have a bucket for that.
Civility. And that not only, as you said, well, they were making money, but also, and that brought them together, but you get a camaraderie if you drive cattle.
And it's hard not to know someone.
And then this fascinating story. So Major Ridge was killed. He was treaty party. His wife, Sarah Ridge, moved to Fayetteville, Arkansas, and her house is right over here near the downtown. And her missionary teacher, her tutor to her children was Sophia Sawyer. And they started the first female college in Fayetteville. This is 1830s.
Yeah.
And they had Cherokee and white students. The Civil War blew that up. That cooperation, that respect that was developing. And then the Civil War, North, South, and Cherokee were on both sides. They were Union and Confederate. And they had their own, they were settling those scores. You had basically, of all things, the Treaty Party became more Confederate, and the Removal Party, which were treated worse by the federal government, they became Union for the most part.
I am curious, when you talk about the Cherokee Nation traveling, for example, or the parts of the 5 civilized tribes that came, they brought enslaved people with them as well, too, along this Trail of Tears.
That is correct. I don't know. I know more about the Cherokee because that's who came through Northwest Arkansas, and I just know more about them. Right. They had enslaved people for the most part. That was the Treaty Party. So you just have to go back to Georgia. Treaty Party were the little more well-to-do, so to speak, had plantations, more likely to have slaves. And then the removal, those that resisted removal, which was the majority, were more from you might say, the mountains of North Carolina, and just had smaller farms and were just poorer. They were just surviving. So they didn't own slaves. And so, interestingly enough, as the Civil War broke out, it was the Treaty Party in the Cherokee that maybe had slaves that became joined the Confederacy. And so you're more North Carolina, your Smoky Mountain, more your rural agrarian Cherokee joined the Union. So yeah, there was slavery, and that's a big issue today because that's called the freedmen of today. And then there was a move to take their citizenship away from them, and it got into several years ago a big federal issue. And so today the freedmen are still, and it's the descendants of slaves are Cherokee citizens.
I wasn't sure if you saw in your research within Trail of Tears signs of maybe those kinds of parties coming through, Cherokees with enslaved people that came through Northwest Arkansas on their way, if there's any archaeological or just kind of historical information that you uncovered as a part of your research.
That became a big part of research just in the last 10 years. And the fascinating thing about the Trail of Tears is they have the muster rolls. So all these detachments, we have the list of names of who were on those rolls, who came. And that's where some of them were slaves. It's indisputable that there were slaves. And then the Cherokee Nation have come to full, you might say, acknowledgement or grips of that. And over at one of the museums in Tahlequah, there's a whole hall about the slaves that became Cherokee citizens. The Trail of Tears is not just this isolated story. It's the American story.
Yeah.
So even going back to what I emphasized, it's complicated, and it's not just back in the 1830s. All American citizens rose up en masse and said, we've got to get these Indians out of here. It's very controversial. But down to one vote in the Senate, and a lot of outrage, a lot of newspaper headlines.
John, as I listen to you talk about this story, how do we preserve this? How do we tell more of these stories? How do we make sure that this becomes a part of really the fabric of how we see ourselves and our place and make decisions about what this place should become?
Oh, that's a great question. That's part of the mission of Arkansas Chapter Trail of Tears, National Trail of Tears, Heritage Trail Partners, it's kind of dual faceted. One is to preserve these places because that's so powerful to be able to go to Pea Ridge. For instance, you can go to Prairie Grove at this point and barely know that the Cherokee went through there. Now, the superintendent out there, they want some panels. They want to tell this story. So at Fitzgerald Station, you can drive by Fitzgerald Station. At this point, the sign there that goes back a long ways would only say it's a Butterfield Stagecoach. But it's also a Trail of Tears. Very few people know that. So we need to preserve those places and then better tell those stories. So that can be through, obviously it's road signage. You've probably seen road signage, but kind of events and presentations in schools, presentations in libraries. Because this story, I think, just kind of from seeing your reaction, you've heard some things you hadn't even thought of, how complex this is.
Very complex.
And how relevant it is today, and how we treat each other, how we think about each other, how we think about our friends over in the Indian Nation. This makes me want to go, like, gee, can there be more relationships? Like this Cherokee Youth Choir. We have them come over for events. Well, we need to do more of that. They represent the Cherokee Nation, and they do it so well. And they will come over here in just a heartbeat. I don't know if you're aware, the removal riders, the bicycle riders come through here every year. Well, we can make a bigger deal about that as they come through, and they actually love that. If a community makes a big deal and has a event as they come through, and then let them tell their story, and then have some other people tell the story of removal, because people think it's just in the distant past and has nothing to do with today, but it's so relevant today. So to tell that story and for us to learn more about it, we're still discovering routes in Northwest Arkansas, but the routes we know, to preserve them. I'll just tell one real quick story. At one time, Fitzgerald Station in Springdale, which is a Butterfield stop, there's an old stone barn there. It went on the market, and it could have easily just been sold, and there could be a mini mart there, come and go. But we were aware of its location, and just us and the city of Springdale and Shallow Museum and Heritage Trail Partners raised the awareness of it. And it turns out that a nonprofit group bought it to save it, gave it to the city of Springdale, and now it's a trailhead for the Fitzgerald Mountain Trail System.
I did not know that connection.
So point is, we almost lost it. It was on the market. It was literally just on the market. Somebody could have bought it, dozed that building down, and it'd just be like maybe a signs there. This used to be a Trail of Tears campsite, but now it's like maybe a 10 to 20 acre plot. So
bike trails in there, I
think.
There's
bike trails. It's a trailhead. There's a place to go. We could have, we're working with the Shallow Museum because they kind of oversee it. It's owned by the city of Springdale, and so is the Shallow Museum. So there's plans to have interpretive panels, have events out there. And Mike, I've just found this. I've done presentations at like the Shallow Museum, but we've done Butterfield and Trail of Tears and Civil War. The Trail of Tears is so fascinating to people. We usually fill that little conference room up, and you start telling this story with some PowerPoints and maps and pictures, and you get questions I can hardly get through my material because people are, oh, I didn't know that, or they add that, or like you've done, you add a story. So it's a compelling story. And so it preserve the places and tell the story better.
Within the context of the work that you're doing, you've seen a lot of Northwest Arkansas grow and change, and you've been a part of planning that. You've been a part of helping preserve these stories at a national level, at a state level, at a regional level. What keeps you awake at night? What are your fears for these stories in this place?
Great question. I think what almost happened to Fitzgerald Station is to locate these places, mark them, make people aware of them, and just make sure they're preserved and then duly noted and get some interpretation there. One of the last things I was involved in at Northwest Arkansas Regional Planning Commission was the open space plan. The open space plan was exactly what you're talking about. It was, let's look at these two counties and identify our great places that are still natural. And we had categories, whether they're wetlands or springs or some kind of biodiversity there or historic significance, and just put them on a map. So this map had 4 or 5 layers. It was like a GIS thing. So there's actually the open space plan for Northwest Arkansas. And then the idea is very, I'm going to say, conservative. So it's not like, okay, let's save all these places by rules and regulations or ordinances, but let's just be aware of them. And then when a place that's significant becomes for sale, like Fitzgerald Station, let's make various people aware of it. I think you'll appreciate this. The idea is we are growing these two counties. And do we want to just look like, I'm a Texan, so I can pick on Dallas. Do we just want to look like Dallas in 50 years? Just this all concrete, everything's paved up, not that they haven't saved some stuff. But what can we do that in 50 years, our best places are preserved? Not only the historic places, but then springs and wetlands and the natural beauty of Northwest Arkansas. And I'll kind of wrap up by saying this. When you add to me that historic component, that adds value to why save this piece of land? Why not let, say, the ballpark just get destroyed and paved over? Well, because the Trail of Tears detachment camped there, and it's a story that we need to tell. So let's do the improvement someplace else where this history didn't happen. So it's not just a non-growth idea. It's like, let's save our best places.
I love that. And you may have been answering this question already, but John, I think one thing that we're always trying to understand is what this idea of community wholeness looks like. And you may have just answered that question and how you laid out how we think about that. But what does wholeness look like in this space to you?
I think it's being aware of our past, and not just for the sake of preserving it, but remembering these events and how they shaped this area, and then how that can influence our life today. And just me personally, the whole Cherokee idea is so compelling. That adds meaning to my life. I go to Trail of Tears conferences every year and learn new things, develop relationships, but it was because of my awareness that, the Trail of Tears came right through here. I'm walking on ground at the Trail of Tears. So I think to preserve those places, and that brings that wholeness, that how to apply that to our lives today, to make our lives meaningful and our relationships, develop relationship. If I hadn't become involved in the Trail of Tears, I would never have met my good friend, Troy Wayne Poteet, he's a Cherokee citizen. He's been on their Supreme Court. He's the executive director and just the nicest guy in the world. And so knowing him has enriched my life and just the Cherokee people. So it's very relevant for me today. And then to think about how the past, there's some that would portray America today as this evil, horrible nation. And we've always been that way. But when you look at history, and that's why I keep emphasizing, this Treaty of New Echota was very controversial, signed by one vote and then created a Supreme Court crisis that even though it wasn't enforced, but somehow here's our nation still here, kind of that balance of power, fighting among those branches. So it's absolutely relevant to informs today's events.
Yeah.
Things that happened in the 1830s.
Sounds like we could identify with that in some ways, but yeah, John, that sounds like wholeness to me, the way that you describe that within relationship to other people and the work that you've been doing. And so, John, I just want to say thank you for sharing the table, and thanks for all the work that you've done to preserve these stories and to give us a framework, and really the gift that you've given, not just to Northwest Arkansas, but to the Cherokee people as well, too, of a way of thinking about and remembering these events, and to doing so in a way that helps preserve them, hopefully, for all the generations to come. And so, John, just deeply humbled to be able to sit with you and to hear these stories. And I know we just scratched the surface. So I hope that the work that you do continues forward. And yeah, we'll be following along to make sure that as new things are learned, that we can share those back with those listening. And so, John, thank you for the work that you're doing. It's a really incredible work.
Well, thank you, Mike, for having me here. And this is something I'm excited about. And you've pulled out a lot of good information. I hope it's been a blessing to those that are listening.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, an incredible thank you to John McLarty. And I think as we reflect on today's conversation, we're reminded that the Trail of Tears is not only a national story, it is a local one. It is written into the hills and the watersheds and the gravel roads of Northwest Arkansas. It's carried into the memory of the land and the lives and the stories of those who walked under its sorrow and duress. It's believed that at least 35 Native nations were impacted by removal policies, with more than 60,000 people forced from their homelands and an estimated 12,000 to 18,000 lives lost along the way. These are not numbers alone, they are lives and families and hopes and futures that were interrupted. And as we get closer to home, the Trail of Tears through Northwest Arkansas is not invisible if we can choose to still see it. Records show that over 10,000 Cherokees traveled the route that would later become known as Pea Ridge National Military Park. Among them were members of the B.B. Cannon contingent, whose journals recorded glimpses of their journey, including mentions of enslaved people traveling with them. And the later accounts that speak of exhaustion and apprehension as they neared their new homeland in 1838 and 1839. In all of this, I think it's important that we begin with remembering. It begins with reconnecting personally to these stories in these places. One way for me where this all started was on a gravel bike. I traveled along the same ridgelines and the roads where these memories still linger. And if I go back to the first episode of the Underview, there was a bike route. I'm going to share that again. It's a route that travels along the Trail of Tears at Little Sugar Creek. And it was the way that I first began to connect with these stories underway. And if that resonates with you as a way of connecting back to this place and its stories, then I invite you to go do the same. And if that's not for you and you want to start somewhere else, I would recommend a visit to Pea Ridge National Military Park, where the visitor center and the staff can help you understand the trail's path through our region. At Elkhorn Tavern, you can walk a short distance north along the historic Springfield to Fayetteville Road, that old wire road. It is the same trail that was traveled by these detachments nearly 2 centuries ago. It's not a long walk, but it carries a long memory. And as we close, I want to share the voice of a Cherokee woman. I'm going to withhold her name, reflecting on what her grandmother told her about the family's experience on the Trail of Tears. I think in hearing this memory and hearing her voice, it reminds us that these are not distant stories, they are still living ones. They shape the descendants who carry them forward, and they shape all of us who now live in this place. Because perhaps wholeness begins here with remembrance, with reverence, and with the willingness to carry these stories forward in how we live and belong to this place. I want to say thank you for listening. I want to say thank you for being the most important part of what our community is becoming. This is The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place.
Mate, we're on the trail. I have back to 1820.
I've got their lot. I call it their cattle numbers, their allotment numbers.
So your family came over the trail?
Oh yeah, I had those from Carolina, Tennessee, Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. And I've got them traced to 1791 total.
Have you heard any stories about the trail?
Oh yes, my great grandmother was whipped by a soldier and died on the trail.
How come?
She wasn't walking fast enough. This is what the grandmother told me.
Yeah. Where'd that happen?
Somewhere between Carolina and Indian Territory. They came in, when they came in, my grandmother, people, when they came in, it was around where Tahlequah is. In fact, I've got pictures down in there, early date picture. And, oh, I guess it was quite a thing, though.
Houston?
And if you'll notice on that doings for, on the Trail of Tears, you'll find how many left there and how many arrived.
Yeah. And it was her mother that was killed by the trail?
Uh-huh.
What other stories have you heard about the trail?
Oh, nothing except the beatings and rape and slaughter. Just what you would hear. It's the same thing that you have heard about the soldiers on the March of Baton.
Yes.
This is equal to it. It's the same thing, only in a different country.